Richard Palmer had everything a man could want: wealth, power, and a perfect family. As the CEO of Palmer Financial Group, one of the largest financial firms in the city, his reputation was built on success and ambition. On the surface, Richard's life seemed untouchable, a reflection of his hard work and discipline. But behind the polished exterior, there were secrets. 24 years ago, Richard made a mistake that he thought would stay buried forever. At that time, Palmer Financial was growing, and Richard had surrounded himself with the brightest talent. Among them was Naomi Grant, a young, ambitious intern who had quickly caught his eye. She was different from the others, sharp, driven, and radiating with a quiet confidence. But it wasn't just her talent that attracted Richard. There was something more. Late nights working together, shared laughs over coffee breaks. What started as professional slowly became personal. It didn't take long before their relationship crossed the line. Behind closed doors, away from the prying eyes of the office, Richard and Naomi began an affair. For Naomi, it was more than just an affair. It felt like a love story. She believed that Richard cared about her, that their connection was special, even though he was married. In her heart, she thought that someday he might leave his wife and they could be together openly. But for Richard, it was different. It was an indulgence, a thrill, a secret he was sure he could control. That control shattered when Naomi discovered she was pregnant. Terrified and unsure of what to do, Naomi went to Richard, hoping that their relationship meant something to him. She thought that when she told him the news, he would stand by her, that maybe, just maybe, he would take responsibility. But Richard's reaction was far from what she expected. When she sat in his office, her heart racing as she spoke the words, "I'm pregnant," Richard didn't flinch. He didn't yell, he didn't panic. Instead, he looked at her with a cold, calculated expression, the warmth and affection that once marked their secret relationship gone in an instant. "I see," he said simply, as if they were discussing a routine business matter. The silence that followed was suffocating for Naomi, but Richard stayed composed, distant. He made it clear that this news wasn't welcome, it wasn't part of his plan. Naomi's heart sank as she realized that the man she thought she knew was not going to stand by her. Desperately, she added, "It's yours, Richard." "What are we going to do?" But Richard didn't share her desperation. To him, this was a problem that needed to be erased, not a life that needed nurturing. His next words were colder than anything Naomi had ever imagined. "This is unfortunate," he said, leaning back in his chair, "but you should have been more careful." Naomi sat there, stunned. The man she had trusted was now treating her like a liability, something that could ruin his carefully crafted life. She tried to hold back her tears, tried to reason with him, but Richard was already mentally distancing himself from the situation. "I'm married, Naomi," he continued, his voice devoid of emotion. "I have a family and a reputation to protect. This can't happen." "But I'm keeping the baby," Naomi whispered, trying to stand her ground, hoping that Richard would understand. But instead his eyes narrowed and his tone turned sharper. "I can't be involved," he said firmly. "This conversation never happened. And as of today, you're no longer an employee at Palmer Financial Group." Naomi froze. He was firing her. Not only was he rejecting the baby, but he was also cutting her off completely. The man she had trusted, the man she had believed loved her, was now erasing her from his life entirely. She couldn't believe what was happening. "You're firing me? Because of this?" she asked, her voice trembling. Richard leaned forward, his eyes cold. "I'm protecting my family, Naomi, and you should do the same." He stood up, walking to the door of his office, signaling the conversation was over. "You'll receive a severance package, of course, but after today, you're done here." The words cut through her like a knife. Without another glance, Richard left the room, leaving Naomi sitting in silence. Her life completely upended in a matter of minutes. Over the next few weeks, Naomi tried to rebuild her life. She applied for jobs, tried to pick up the pieces, but every door she knocked on was closed in her face. Richard had blacklisted her from the industry. No one would hire her. She was alone, pregnant, and with nowhere to turn. But Naomi wasn't one to give up easily. Despite everything, she decided to raise the child on her own. She knew it would be difficult, but she refused to let Richard's betrayal define her future. She left the city, disappearing from his world, and focused on what mattered most: her son. And for 24 years, that's where Naomi's story stayed, a secret buried in the past, a life built on resilience and survival, far away from the man who had abandoned them. But secrets like these have a way of surfacing. And soon, Richard Palmer would come face to face with the past he thought he had left behind. 24 years had passed since Naomi Grant walked out of Richard Palmer's office for the last time. In those years, Richard had built his empire even higher, securing his place among the wealthiest and most respected men in the city. His family name was synonymous with power and influence. His life was perfectly constructed. At least, that's how it seemed from the outside. For Naomi, life had been different. She had left the city with nothing but the clothes on her back and the child growing inside her. Starting over wasn't easy, but Naomi was resilient. She moved to a quiet town far away from the shadows of her past, working multiple jobs to make ends meet and provide for her son. She never spoke of Richard to anyone, not even to her son. To the world, Richard Palmer didn't exist, and that's how she wanted it to stay. Her son, Marcus, grew up without a father, but Naomi made sure he never felt the absence. She gave him everything she could, pouring all her love and strength into raising him. Marcus was bright, ambitious, and determined, just like his mother. As he grew older, he began to ask questions about his father, but Naomi never revealed the truth. "Your father wasn't part of our lives," she'd say, and Marcus, sensing the pain behind her words, never pressed further. Now, Marcus Grant was a man in his own right. At 24, he had recently graduated from college with a degree in finance. Naomi had always been proud of him, seeing in him the same drive and determination she had when she was younger. But Marcus's success was more than just a point of pride. It was the culmination of everything Naomi had sacrificed. After graduation, Marcus applied for jobs at top firms across the city. He had worked hard, and his resume reflected that. One day, to his surprise, he received an offer from Palmer Financial Group, one of the most prestigious financial institutions in the country. To Marcus, this was the opportunity of a lifetime. Palmer Financial was a company he had always admired, a symbol of everything he aspired to be. He didn't know much about its CEO, Richard Palmer, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the chance to prove himself, to finally make his mark. The day before Marcus started his new job, he visited his mother. Naomi's hair had grown streaked with grey over the years, but she still had the same fiery spirit that had carried her through the toughest times. She smiled when she saw him, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Mom, I've got big news," Marcus said as he sat down at their small kitchen table. "I got the job." Naomi's heart swelled with pride, though she couldn't ignore the slight tremor in her hands as she placed a cup of tea in front of him. "That's wonderful, Marcus. Which company?" "Palmer Financial Group," Marcus replied, excitement in his voice. "It's one of the top firms. I can't believe I got in." Naomi froze. The name sent a chill through her, and her grip on the teacup tightened. She had spent 24 years trying to forget that name, trying to erase it from her life. But now, here it was, right in front of her. She looked at Marcus, her heart pounding in her chest. "Palmer Financial," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus nodded, oblivious to the storm brewing inside her. "Yeah, It's the opportunity of a lifetime, Mom. I can't wait to get started. Naomi's mind raced. She had always known that one day Marcus might stumble upon the truth about his father, but she never expected it to happen like this. She felt a knot forming in her stomach. Should she tell him now? Should she finally reveal the truth about Richard Palmer? Or should she stay silent, let Marcus find his own way? She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Marcus," she began slowly, choosing her words carefully, "there's something you should know about that company, about Richard Palmer." Marcus frowned, sensing the shift in her tone. "What do you mean?" Naomi looked into her son's eyes, her heart aching with the weight of the secret she had carried for so long. "Richard Palmer, he's your father." The room fell silent. Marcus stared at her, disbelief flickering across his face. "What? That can't be true. You never said anything." "I know," Naomi said quietly. "I didn't want you to grow up with that burden. He walked away from us, Marcus. He didn't want to be a part of your life." Marcus's mind spun, trying to process what he was hearing. Richard Palmer, the man he had admired from afar, the CEO of the company he was about to work for, was his father. Anger and confusion surged inside him. "Why didn't you tell me?" he demanded, his voice shaking. "All these years I've wondered who my father was, and you never said a word." Naomi's eyes filled with tears. "I wanted to protect you. I didn't want you to grow up knowing that the man who gave you life didn't want to be part of it." Marcus stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He couldn't believe it. He had grown up without a father, and now, after all this time, he was learning that the man he was about to work for had abandoned him and his mother. "I need to go," he muttered, his voice tight with emotion. "I need to think." Without waiting for a response, Marcus grabbed his jacket and stormed out of the apartment, leaving Naomi alone, tears streaming down her face. She had tried to protect him, but now the truth was out, and she feared it would destroy everything she had worked so hard to build. As Marcus walked through the city, his mind raced. He felt betrayed, not just by his mother's silence, but by the fact that the man he had admired was the same man who had left them with nothing. He didn't know what to do next, but one thing was certain. When he stepped into that office tomorrow, he wouldn't be just another employee. He would be the son Richard Palmer never wanted, and he would make sure his father knew it. The next morning, Marcus walked into the towering building of Palmer Financial Group, his mind still reeling from the conversation with his mother. His emotions were a whirlwind, anger, confusion, and a deep sense of betrayal. But beneath it all, there was something else growing: determination. He was no longer just a new hire at one of the most prestigious firms in the city. He was a man on a mission, and the man he sought was at the very top. As Marcus entered the lobby, the sleek glass walls and polished floors reflected the image of a world built on wealth and power. It was a far cry from the modest apartment where he had grown up, watching his mother struggle to make ends meet. Marcus had always known that his drive to succeed came from those difficult years, but now, knowing the full truth, the stakes felt even higher. He approached the receptionist, his heart pounding in his chest. "Marcus Grant," he said, forcing his voice to stay steady. "I'm here for my first day." The receptionist smiled, not sensing the tension simmering just beneath Marcus's calm exterior. "Welcome, Mr. Grant. You'll be meeting with your team first. Your office is on the 15th floor." Marcus nodded, but as he rode the elevator up, his thoughts weren't on the tasks ahead. His mind kept circling back to one question. What would happen when he finally came face to face with Richard Palmer? The elevator doors opened with a soft ding, and Marcus stepped out into a bustling office space. The energy was palpable, people moving quickly from one meeting to another, phone calls being made, deals being closed. It was the kind of high-stakes environment Marcus had dreamed of being part of, but now all he could think about was the man at the top of it all. He was greeted by his immediate supervisor, a tall, efficient woman named Clara Moore. She welcomed him warmly, giving him a brief overview of his role and introducing him to the rest of the team. Marcus did his best to appear engaged, nodding and smiling at the right moments, but his thoughts kept drifting. Every minute felt like a countdown to the inevitable confrontation with Richard. Around noon, just as Marcus was settling into his work, he heard whispers among some of his colleagues. Richard Palmer was in the office today. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. The moment he had been dreading and anticipating was drawing closer. Clara approached his desk, pulling him from his thoughts. "Marcus, Richard Palmer has asked to meet with you personally. He likes to check in with new hires from time to time, especially those he thinks have potential. It's a great opportunity for you." Marcus nodded, his pulse quickening. "Thank you, Clara. I'll be ready." Clara smiled and walked away, leaving Marcus alone with the knowledge that in just a few moments he would be standing in front of the man who had changed the course of his life without even knowing it. The walk to Richard's office felt surreal. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest as he made his way down the long hallway lined with awards and framed photos of Richard shaking hands with powerful figures. The closer he got, the more his mind raced. What would he say? How would Richard react? Would he even recognize the name Grant after all these years? Finally, Marcus reached the large, polished wooden doors of Richard Palmer's office. He took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he knocked. "Come in," came the voice from inside, calm and composed. Marcus pushed the door open and stepped inside. The office was massive, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline. Behind an imposing mahogany desk sat Richard Palmer, the man who had shaped Marcus's life without ever being present in it. He looked up from the papers on his desk, his expression professional, though his eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen and done it all. "Marcus Grant," Richard said with a small, practiced smile as he stood and extended his hand. "Welcome to Palmer Financial Group. It's good to meet you." Marcus took his hand, feeling the strength in Richard's grip, but also the coldness in his eyes. It was strange. Richard didn't recognize him. He had no idea who Marcus really was. To him, Marcus was just another employee, another cog in the machine. "Thank you, Mr. Palmer," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside him. Richard gestured to the chair in front of his desk. "Please, sit. I like to meet our new hires personally. It gives me a sense of who's joining our team. Your resume stood out. Strong academic background, impressive internships. I'm expecting great things from you, Marcus." Marcus sat down, his hands gripping the armrests of the chair. He looked at Richard, the man who had walked away from his responsibilities, the man who had left his mother to raise him alone. And now, here he was, speaking to Marcus as if they were strangers, as if none of it had ever happened. "I appreciate the opportunity," Marcus said, his voice cool. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep up the pretense. The tension in the room was thick, but only Marcus seemed to feel it. Richard leaned back in his chair, studying Marcus for a moment. "Grant," he said, tapping his fingers lightly on the desk. "That's a strong name. Any relation to the Grants in the South? There used to be a prominent family there in the business world." Marcus's heart raced. He had expected this moment, but it still hit him hard. He took a breath, his gaze locking onto Richard's. "No," he said, his voice low. "Not from the South, but it's a name that's been important in my life." Richard nodded, not pressing further, still unaware of the weight behind Marcus's words. "Well, regardless, I'm glad you're here. Palmer Financial is a place where the best rise quickly. Work hard, and you'll find success." Marcus nodded, the anger simmering just beneath the surface. How could Richard sit here, giving him advice on success, when he had stripped his mother of everything? How could he speak so casually, as if Marcus were just another face, when he had ignored his very existence for 24 years? The conversation went on, but Marcus barely registered the words. His mind was focused on one thing: when to tell him, when to shatter the illusion Richard had built for himself. The longer Richard spoke, the clearer it became to Marcus that the man had no idea who he was, no idea of the damage he had caused. Finally, as the meeting drew to a close, Richard stood and extended his hand again. "I look forward to seeing what you accomplish here, Marcus." Marcus stood as well, but instead of shaking Richard's hand, he met his gaze with a cold intensity. "I'm sure you do," he said quietly. "But there's something you should know." Richard frowned slightly, his hand still extended. "What's that?" Marcus's heart pounded in his chest, but his voice was steady. "I'm not just any new hire. I'm Marcus Grant, and Naomi Grant is my mother." For the first time, Richard's calm demeanor cracked. His eyes widened and his hand slowly dropped to his side. The name hit him like a punch to the gut. Marcus could see the realization dawning in his eyes, the recognition, the guilt, the shock. Richard's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He stared at Marcus, the color draining from his face. The past he had buried so carefully, the secret he thought he had left behind, was now standing in front of him in the form of a young man he had never expected to see. Marcus didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked out of the office, leaving Richard standing there in stunned silence. The confrontation had begun, but the battle was far from over. Clara smiled and walked away, leaving Marcus alone with the knowledge that in just a few moments he would be standing in front of the man who had changed the course of his life without even knowing it. The walk to Richard's office felt surreal. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest as he made his way down the long hallway lined with awards and framed photos of Richard shaking hands with powerful figures. The closer he got, the more his mind raced. What would he say? How would Richard react? Would he even recognize the name Grant after all these years? Finally, Marcus reached the large, polished wooden doors of Richard Palmer's office. He took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he knocked. "Come in," came the voice from inside, calm and composed. Marcus pushed the door open and stepped inside. The office was massive, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline. Behind an imposing mahogany desk sat Richard Palmer, the man who had shaped Marcus's life without ever being present in it. He looked up from the papers on his desk, his expression professional, though his eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen and done it all. "Marcus Grant," Richard said with a small, practiced smile as he stood and extended his hand. "Welcome to Palmer Financial Group. It's good to meet you." Marcus took his hand, feeling the strength in Richard's grip, but also the coldness in his eyes. It was strange. Richard didn't recognize him. He had no idea who Marcus really was. To him, Marcus was just another employee, another cog in the machine. "Thank you, Mr. Palmer," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside him. Richard gestured to the chair in front of his desk. "Please, sit. I like to meet our new hires personally. It gives me a sense of who's joining our team. Your resume stood out. Strong academic background, impressive internships. I'm expecting great things from you, Marcus." Marcus sat down, his hands gripping the armrests of the chair. He looked at Richard, the man who had walked away from his responsibilities, the man who had left his mother to raise him alone. And now, here he was, speaking to Marcus as if they were strangers, as if none of it had ever happened. "I appreciate the opportunity," Marcus said, his voice cool. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep up the pretense. The tension in the room was thick, but only Marcus seemed to feel it. Richard leaned back in his chair, studying Marcus for a moment. "Grant," he said, tapping his fingers lightly on the desk. "That's a strong name. Any relation to the Grants in the South? There used to be a prominent family there in the business world." Marcus's heart raced. He had expected this moment, but it still hit him hard. He took a breath, his gaze locking onto Richard's. "No," he said, his voice low. "Not from the South, but it's a name that's been important in my life." Richard nodded, not pressing further, still unaware of the weight behind Marcus's words. "Well, regardless, I'm glad you're here. Palmer Financial is a place where the best rise quickly. Work hard, and you'll find success." Marcus nodded, the anger simmering just beneath the surface. How could Richard sit here, giving him advice on success, when he had stripped his mother of everything? How could he speak so casually, as if Marcus were just another face, when he had ignored his very existence for 24 years? The conversation went on, but Marcus barely registered the words. His mind was focused on one thing: when to tell him, when to shatter the illusion Richard had built for himself. The longer Richard spoke, the clearer it became to Marcus that the man had no idea who he was, no idea of the damage he had caused. Finally, as the meeting drew to a close, Richard stood and extended his hand again. "I look forward to seeing what you accomplish here, Marcus." Marcus stood as well, but instead of shaking Richard's hand, he met his gaze with a cold intensity. "I'm sure you do," he said quietly. "But there's something you should know." Richard frowned slightly, his hand still extended. "What's that?" Marcus's heart pounded in his chest, but his voice was steady. "I'm not just any new hire. I'm Marcus Grant, and Naomi Grant is my mother." For the first time, Richard's calm demeanor cracked. His eyes widened and his hand slowly dropped to his side. The name hit him like a punch to the gut. Marcus could see the realization dawning in his eyes, the recognition, the guilt, the shock. Richard's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He stared at Marcus, the color draining from his face. The past he had buried so carefully, the secret he thought he had left behind, was now standing in front of him in the form of a young man he had never expected to see. Marcus didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked out of the office, leaving Richard standing there in stunned silence. The confrontation had begun, but the battle was far from over. Marcus stepped out of Richard's office, his heart racing, but his steps steady. The hallway felt longer, quieter than before, as if the very air around him had shifted. He had done it. He had spoken the truth, and the look of shock on Richard Palmer's face had been worth every agonizing moment leading up to it. But as the adrenaline slowly drained from his system, Marcus was left with the lingering question: what comes next? Back at his desk, Marcus tried to focus on his work, but his mind kept drifting back to that moment in Richard's office. He had expected anger, denial, maybe even a confrontation, but instead there had been silence. The look on Richard's face, the recognition, the guilt, had been enough to confirm everything Marcus had suspected. The man knew exactly what he had done, and now he could no longer run from it. The hours ticked by slowly, the usual office buzz around Marcus feeling distant, almost irrelevant. He kept glancing at the clock, half expecting Richard to call him back into his office or send for him to explain. But no call came. It was as if Richard had retreated, too stunned to react immediately. Marcus wasn't surprised. Richard had been blindsided. The man had spent decades building a life, a career, a family, and now that carefully constructed world was starting to crack. As the workday came to a close, Marcus decided it was time to leave. He needed space, time to think, and to prepare for what was sure to come next. He gathered his things, ignoring the friendly chatter of his co-workers around him, and made his way to the elevator. As the doors slid closed behind him, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the real confrontation was yet to come. Later that evening, back in his small apartment, Marcus sat at the kitchen table, staring at his phone. He had promised his mother that he would tell her how the meeting went, but now that the moment had come, he wasn't sure how to begin. How could he explain the complexity of what had happened, the quiet intensity of the encounter, the weight of Richard's silence, and the feeling that things were only just beginning? With a deep breath, Marcus dialed his mother's number. The phone rang twice before Naomi's familiar voice answered on the other end. "Marcus," she asked, her voice soft but filled with concern. "How did it go?" Marcus hesitated for a moment, then spoke. "I told him, Mom. I told him who I am." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Marcus could picture his mother's face, the mixture of relief and fear that must have been crossing her features. "And?" Naomi asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What did he say?" "He didn't say much," Marcus admitted. "At first he didn't even recognize me, but when I told him your name, our name, he knew. You should have seen his face, Mom. It was like he had seen a ghost." Naomi let out a slow, shaky breath. "So he remembers." "Oh, he remembers," Marcus said, his voice laced with a bitterness he hadn't expected. He didn't deny it. He didn't even try. He just stood there like he was too stunned to speak. Another pause. Marcus could hear his mother's breathing on the other end of the line, steady but heavy, as if the weight of the past had settled on her shoulders once again. "What are you going to do next?" she asked finally. Marcus leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know yet. I wasn't expecting him to react the way he did. I thought there'd be more of a fight, but now I'm not sure what happens. I just know that I can't let him walk away from this, not without consequences." Naomi's voice was soft, but filled with concern. "Marcus, I know how angry you are. I've been angry too, for so many years. But be careful. Richard Palmer is a powerful man, and confronting him won't be easy. He's spent his whole life controlling things, controlling people. He won't just let this go." "I know," Marcus said quietly, "but he needs to face what he did. He ruined your life, Mom. He ruined our lives, and he can't just sit in that office pretending like none of it ever happened." Naomi sighed. "I don't want you getting hurt in this, Marcus. I've already lost too much because of him. I don't want to lose you, too." "You won't lose me," Marcus promised. "I'm not afraid of him, and I'm not going to let him win this time." The conversation ended soon after, but Marcus's mind was far from settled. He knew his mother was right. Richard Palmer was a powerful man, and confronting him would come with risks. But Marcus had come too far to back down now. He had lived his entire life without knowing the full truth, and now that he had it, he wasn't going to let Richard walk away unscathed. The next morning, Marcus walked into the office with a renewed sense of purpose. Today, things would be different. He wouldn't just wait for Richard to make the next move. He would take control. The silence from Richard's office yesterday had been unsettling, but Marcus knew it wouldn't last. The confrontation was inevitable, and Marcus was ready for it. As the morning wore on, Marcus kept his focus on his work, though his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't stop thinking about what Richard's next move would be. Would he try to avoid the situation altogether? Would he call Marcus in and try to reason with him, to strike some kind of deal? Or would he lash out, using his power and influence to silence Marcus before things could go any further? By midday, Marcus had his answer. Just as he was finishing up a report, he received an email. The subject line was simple: meeting request. His heart skipped a beat as he opened the email. It was from Richard Palmer's assistant, requesting that Marcus meet with Richard in his office at 1 p.m. Marcus stared at the screen for a long moment, his mind racing. This was it, the moment of truth. Richard was ready to confront him, and Marcus needed to be prepared for whatever came next. At precisely 1 p.m., Marcus found himself standing outside Richard's office once again. This time, there was no hesitation. He knocked on the door, his heart steady, his mind clear. "Come in," Richard's voice called from inside. Marcus stepped into the office, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Richard was seated behind his desk, his face composed but tense. The easy confidence from their first meeting was gone, replaced by something harder, colder. "Sit," Richard said, his voice tight. Marcus sat down, his eyes never leaving Richard's. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension, and Marcus knew that this conversation would determine everything. Richard leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "I think we need to have a real conversation, Marcus, about what happened all those years ago." Marcus didn't flinch. "I agree, it's about time we talked." Richard sat back in his chair, his eyes fixed on Marcus. The air between them was charged with tension, the silence stretching uncomfortably. Marcus could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but he was ready. This was the confrontation he had been waiting for. Richard broke the silence first. His voice was measured, but there was a sharp edge to it. "Marcus, I want you to understand something. What happened back then, it was complicated. There were decisions I had to make for my family, for my career. I couldn't afford to let a mistake—" "A mistake?" Marcus interrupted, his voice tight with controlled anger. "You call what happened a mistake? You didn't just make a mistake, Richard. You destroyed my mother's life. You abandoned us." Richard's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond immediately. He looked down at his hands, clasped on the desk in front of him, before finally meeting Marcus's gaze again. "I did what I thought was necessary at the time." "What was necessary?" Marcus shot back. "Firing her? Blacklisting her from the industry so she couldn't find work anywhere else? You left her with nothing, Richard. She raised me on her own, struggling to survive, while you went on to build this empire." Richard shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable, but he didn't deny it. "I won't pretend that what I did was right. I was selfish. I was scared. But you have to understand, I had a family, a reputation to protect. I couldn't afford for that situation to come out." Marcus's fists clenched in his lap, his anger simmering just below the surface. "And what about my mother? What about her life? Her career? You were scared of losing everything you'd built, but you didn't care that you took everything from her. You left her with nothing." Richard leaned forward, his voice lowering. "I was young, Marcus. I didn't know how to handle it. I made mistakes, but I've built something here, something that's helped a lot of people. My career, my company, my family. I couldn't let one mistake destroy all of that." Marcus shook his head, his voice filled with disbelief. "So, you sacrificed us to protect yourself, and now you think you can just sit here, explain it away, and we'll move on?" Richard's face hardened, his calm demeanor slipping. "What do you want from me, Marcus? Do you want me to apologize? Fine. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what I did to your mother. I'm sorry for what you went through, but I can't change the past." Marcus leaned forward, his voice low and intense. "I don't need your apology. I need you to understand the damage you caused. You think this is just about the past? This is about accountability. You walked away and built your life on the back of someone else's suffering, and you never looked back. That's the problem, Richard. You never cared." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Richard's expression faltered, and for a moment Marcus saw something like regret flash across his face. But it was fleeting, quickly replaced by the same guarded, businesslike demeanor. "What do you expect me to do, Marcus?" Richard asked, his voice quieter now, almost weary. "You want me to step down? You want me to give you money? What's the solution here?" Marcus took a deep breath, steadying himself. He had thought about this moment for so long, but now that it was here, he realized that what he wanted wasn't something Richard could easily give. "I don't want your money," Marcus said, his voice firm, "and I don't care if you step down. What I want is for you to face what you did, to admit that your success came at a cost my mother and I paid. And I want you to make sure it never happens to anyone else." Richard stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he let out a slow breath and leaned back in his chair. "You're asking for something I can't just fix, Marcus." "I'm not asking for a fix," Marcus replied. "I'm asking for you to take responsibility. You owe it to us, to my mother, to me, to make this right in whatever way you can." Richard was silent, his gaze distant as if he were contemplating the weight of Marcus's words. The confident businessman, the man who had built an empire, seemed smaller now, vulnerable in a way Marcus hadn't expected. Finally, Richard nodded, though his eyes remained fixed on the desk in front of him. "I don't know how to make this right, but I'll try. I don't know where to begin, but I'll do what I can." Marcus stood up, his chest tight with emotion. "I'm not asking for perfection, Richard. I'm asking for you to try, to finally take some responsibility for the choices you made." Richard nodded again, though the weariness in his expression suggested he was still grappling with the enormity of what Marcus had asked. For the first time in their entire interaction, he seemed genuinely uncertain of how to move forward. Without another word, Marcus turned and walked out of the office. As the door closed softly behind him, he felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, anger, sadness. The confrontation was over, but the scars of the past would remain. Yet for the first time, he felt like the weight of the past was finally beginning to lift. As he stepped into the elevator, Marcus realized something important. This wasn't the end of the story, but it was the beginning of something new. He had confronted the man who had shaped so much of his life without ever being present in it. Now he could start moving forward, free from the shadows of the past. And no matter what happened next, Marcus knew one thing for sure: Richard Palmer could no longer hide from the truth.